everybody, and welcome to this week's High Altitude Garden Series. I'm Monica Pless. I'm the Farm to School Director here at Guidestone, Colorado. And so I'm going to try and give a bunch of different tips and tricks of the trade that I've used mostly on larger farms, especially, but can really help you both harvest things right at the peak of their freshness, harvest them efficiently, which is even more important if you have a larger area that you're harvesting, so you spend more time on it, and just to set you up to make sure that you're keeping them as long as possible. And I know last week's episode we sort of talked about how to keep veggies fresh, but a big part of that is harvesting them right so that they get off to the best start for that. So the first part of harvesting efficiently, we're not doing the best job at the moment, and that's keeping things weeded. So we did just weed our pole beans. We did a session a couple weeks ago about trellising techniques. So I really like doing beans that are pole beans, because when I put up a trellis, these will be much easier to pick than our bush beans, where we'll have to actually move the plants around at the base. But having them be freshly weeded really makes a big difference, because it's just much easier to find the beans. If you're really trying to go for a lot of beans and you don't want to spend too much time picking them, I like using the purple beans or the yellow beans, because they're much easier to spot. The green beans really match the color of the leaves really closely, and so they're a little bit harder to spot. Over here we have some very weedy mesclun, but I thought it would be, we're done harvesting this for the year, but we haven't gotten rid of it yet. So I thought it would be a good place to talk a little bit about harvesting loose greens. So one of the things about efficient harvest is making sure you have the right knife. When I'm harvesting loose greens like arugula or leaf lettuce, or different Asian greens like baby kale or baby chard or baby beet greens that I'm going to put into a salad mix, I like to use these serrated knives. I get them from Johnny's Selected Seeds. You can definitely use these straight knives as well, but especially with the straight knives, you want to really make sure your knives are sharp. There's nothing more frustrating than getting out there and trying to harvest and trying to beat the heat of the day, because you do want to try and harvest when things are relatively cool, and just be really struggling with your knives. Also, dull knives, you're going to put more pressure on, and it's more likely that you're going to cut yourself. And I have cut sort of every finger on my left hand at some point harvesting. When we're harvesting for our production during coronavirus, we all wear masks and we all wear gloves, but I wanted you to be able to see what my hands are doing. When I'm harvesting loose greens, I prefer the red knife, the serrated knife. I'm right-handed, so I keep my knife in my right hand, my dominant hand. I take my non-dominant hand and I hold it almost upside down, and then I'm cutting about 3/4 of an inch above the ground, and I'm sort of gathering, and then when my hand can't hold anymore, that's when I put it into the bin. I always like to sort of start in one place. It's usually really clear with greens. I also, for the ease of harvest, like to plant my greens separately, each individual variety, instead of in a mix, because I found that sometimes there are greens that will hang on longer in the heat of the summer before they bolt, or will hang on longer as it gets colder in the late fall and early winter. And this way, if all of my Tokyo Bacana has gone to seed, I can still go ahead and make up some mesclun mix with this red Russian kale and with this Mizuna. And so that's part of the reason I like to harvest them. I like to plant them separately. They also sometimes grow at different rates, and so I could decide, I have been harvesting all 4 varieties, but if I want to just harvest the Tokyo Bacana, if it's gotten a lot bigger, I could harvest it and bunch it as braising greens, and then I'm not trying to resort it. We're gonna go find a few radishes, and one trick I have for, especially with a CSA, where we're trying to distribute produce in bunches a lot of times, or for market if you're bunching your market carrots or your market beets or your market radishes. I like to count out the number of rubber bands and just put them around my wrist. And we try to find this sort of mid-weight rubber band so that it is small enough that we can put several of them around our wrist without cutting off circulation. We're gonna have to walk back a little bit here. Because that way you can have them here. Like, we've also used them where they've been around just 3 fingers if they're tighter rubber bands. But the problem with that is that a lot of times then they just like fall off as you're harvesting. Like, you can sort of see they're a lot looser. So I like having them around my wrist. And when I am looking for bunches of radishes and turnips, I like to let people know when they're harvesting, I'll pass around a sample bunch so that people get a sense of the weight that I'm looking for. But I also sometimes will tell people, like, this is what I'm looking for, you know? I'm looking for kind of the size of a racquetball, or I'm looking for bigger than a ping pong ball. And then I might say, you know, if you have all racquetballs, we want 5 in a bunch. And if you have all closer to ping pong balls, we want 7 in a bunch. And then one thing that I find is really important on most farms, like the biggest slowdown spot is in the wash station. And so if I'm working with something like this, that I chose as an example, because we kind of have to be kind of picky. So I want to take off as many of these gross leaves out in the field for 2 reasons. The first is that I want those leaves are basically going to compost in the field, and they're going to go back to, like, add more back to the soil. So I don't want to, like, take them in, weigh them. It's going to get our sort of weights and our yields off, because I don't think of that as like something that's a usable yield. And I don't want to take them in and then have to take them right back out. So I'm going to, like, pull these off. I'm going to make sure that it looks good. With things like, if I'm selling this wholesale, I save a lot of time by I just would cut the whole, all the greens off, because usually in wholesale, like in institutional kitchens, we sell to the school district and we sell to the hospital here. They don't have room, and they don't really want the tops. The school district, if we have really nice salad turnip tops, they'll take the turnip greens. But usually if they've ordered 5 pounds of turnips, they want 5 pounds of the roots. And so that's sort of what they're planning for in terms of their harvest and in terms of their orders. So once I've cleaned these up, and you know, we usually only have 1 person in our wash station, so that's part of why if we have 3 or 4 people out here harvesting, it's way more efficient for the people harvesting to do as much of the cleanup as possible, so that then when somebody's in the wash station by themselves, they're not trying to clean up 28 bunches of turnips. So I'm going to give that 3 wraps so that it's pretty securely held. The other times that I would not use the tops is like if it's carrots and the tops are really falling off a lot, then sometimes I will bunch the carrots themselves. But usually I feel like for farmers market or for CSA, I want to bunch the tops. And so even if the tops aren't something that most people would use or that aren't in the best shape, I'll try and clean them up so that they'll at least hold the bunch. We're gonna walk back. We're gonna find our knives again so we don't leave them in the field. So when I am writing up our harvest sheet, I write things up, the amounts that we want, using sort of 3 different metrics. So one is bunches, and then we'll have somebody, a volunteer maybe, go ahead and count out the bunches ahead of time. So we'll know that if we need 28 bunches for CSA, that we will have little stacks of 28 rubber bands, and one of those stacks will be for turnips, and one of those stacks will be for carrots. And that way, when we go out into the field to harvest, we just divide up the number of rubber bands in that stack, and then we know we have harvested everything we need. Sometimes we're harvesting by weight, especially for institutional accounts, and then we'll bring our scale out here and we'll put it on the scale and we'll add things in there and then check kind of regularly to make sure we know when we get to our amount. Let's go down and look at lettuce, because lettuce is the other way we count. We'll get to lettuce in 1 second. First, we're gonna go look at squash. So there's some things, and I think of them as basically the fruiting crops. You want to harvest everything that's ready, because if a fruiting crop stays on the vine too long and gets too old, it sends a message to the plant like, yes, you have successfully reproduced, your work here is done, and then the plant will like stop producing more flowers and thus stop producing more fruit. The same holds for flowers if you're growing cut flowers. Same idea, that you want to continuously cut those flowers before they get mature and put out mature seeds, or the plant will stop producing. So over here we have some summer squash. We just harvested these this morning, so there's not going to be anything on here. When I'm thinking about how big of something I want to harvest, I am kind of like checking these. I'll often walk to the end. Walking to the end offers me two benefits. The first is that I can sort of eyeball the size of what is out there. And so I kind of get a sense of like, okay, our biggest ones this week are this big, or our biggest ones this week are this big. So we really need to make sure we get the big ones, because nobody really wants those like zucchini that have grown into baseball bats. I mean, if you get some in your CSA share, don't worry, they're still good. You can make them into like zucchini boats, or you can make them into, shred them and put them into a zucchini bread. But we usually try and aim for those nice, tender young ones. So I can get a sort of sense of where we're at. I want to try and get all of the ones that are at least the size that I want. Sometimes that depends on when my next harvest is. So when I farmed in Missouri, in the middle of the summer, we would harvest zucchini and squash, summer squash and cucumbers, at least 3 days a week, and sometimes as much as 5, because they would just grow so fast. Here we're in a space where we can usually do it on just harvesting Mondays and Fridays, so twice a week. And so it might be that if I know it's going to be a little longer span, I might try and pick them a little bit smaller, so that we don't have any of those giant ones. The other reason I like to start at the back of the bed is that especially with something like kind of hefty, like tomatoes or squash, or for sure a winter squash, is that when I'm bringing it up, it's heavy, right? So by the time the bin is heavy, then I'm at least at the front of the bed. I'm as close as I can get to our wash station, or if it's on a larger scale, like to my harvest truck or whatever it is. And then I would slice it off. Like I said, we just harvested these today, so we don't have any more that are ripe, but you can sort of see, like, as I'm estimating what we have for next week, I can also take a look at the baby squash that are starting to develop and get a sense of how many we can expect for the next week as I'm planning what we should include in our CSA for the next week, and what we should offer to our institutional accounts going forward. Great. So while we're here, we're going to harvest a lettuce. This lettuce is over here. We've been interplanting our lettuce with our broccoli, because by the time the broccoli starts getting big and shading out the lettuce is pretty much ready. With lettuce, again, sort of the same move. I'm taking my non-dominant hand, I'm turning it sort of upside down, and I'm pushing the leaves up and away so I can see the bottom. With lettuce, I'm better off cutting even underground, too low, because then I can always come back and do a cleanup cut, and I can come back and I can take off any yellow or brown looking leaves. If I cut too high, then the head of lettuce all falls apart. You can still have it as leaf lettuce, but it's not always the best if you're trying to harvest sort of X number of heads for CSA. So that's the last way we count things for CSA, is that if I was harvesting this with a group, we would know the number. Let's say it's 28, and I would harvest one, and I'd be like 1, and then somebody else would say 2, 3, and so we are jointly counting up to 28 so we know where we're at. With things like squash, peas, tomatoes, peppers, all of those fruiting crops, usually what we're trying to harvest is as much as possible, or really is as much as is ripe. We can hold these pretty well in the refrigerator for a couple of days, but we want to make sure that we're not letting those plants know that things have already gotten mature and that they can stop producing. So we're going to walk over to the wash station real fast. And one last thing that I mentioned last week on keeping your produce fresh is to make sure that you are oh, we're gonna go this way, just kidding, watering especially like leafy greens the night before you harvest them. That makes sure that all of their cells are really nice and plump and juicy, because as you store them, they're only gonna be letting go of that moisture, so making sure that they're really in good shape to begin with. So this is one of my other favorite little farm hacks for harvesting, and that is what I call the belt bucket. I've done this a lot of times with larger buckets. What we have here is a clean yogurt container, and I have cut 2 slits in it vertically, just about 2 inches wide, so that I could literally put my belt through it, and then I can attach it onto the belt. And then I have 2 hands for picking. This is one of my favorite ways for picking peas. It's one of my favorite ways for picking cherry tomatoes, because I could even add 2 buckets on, and then I have 2 hands free, so I can pick twice as fast. Actually, let's go through we'll go through the movable high tunnel, and we can put it to use. So I'm gonna just look at this, and here's one of our fruiting crops. This is our sun gold cherry tomatoes, and I'm gonna pick it. When I do pick it, I do like to take the tops off, because otherwise, as they start piling up in here, the tops can poke other tomatoes and then leave these little holes in them, and that's no good. While we're in here, I'll talk briefly about basil as well. So I mentioned this last week that we don't want to put basil in the refrigerator because it actually gets damaged if it's under 37 degrees. So with basil, I'm going to look for either a side shoot, and I'm going to cut it right where it attaches to the main stem, or on the main stem, I'm going to look for where there is starting to be a branch, and I'm going to cut it right above one of the branches. And I can kind of decide if I want to cut it at any of those branches. And then I'm going to put those, I might use my rubber band when I get to a bunch. A bunch is usually more than 2, but you'll get the idea. I'm going to rubber band those together, and then I'm going to put them into a little container that would have a little bit of water in it. I don't want that water to be very deep, but I want to make sure that all the stems are in the water, so I might just do about 1 inch, so that if my stems aren't 100% even across the bottom, that they're all in the water. But I don't want to have any leaves in the water, because getting water on the leaves will damage them. All right, we can keep walking through here. And we're going to go out, just leave it.
Okay.
We'll go out through here, and we'll go to see the wash station. When I think about the wash station, I'm trying to think about the flow of, like, produce is coming in, it's getting recorded, the weight of it, and then it's being washed. And then we kind of want the end of the wash station to be closest to whatever kind of cooler we have. A lot of the reason that we wash produce is actually to get the heat off of it, because once we get the heat off of it, it'll hold a lot longer. And even though we're going to put it in the refrigerator, if we can take that temperature of the produce from about, say, 90, if we are pulling it in like squash in the middle of the day, even if we can get it down to 60, it's going to be a lot easier for a walk-in cooler or a refrigerator to continue to bring that temperature down to the upper 30s, which is kind of where most things hold best. So I would only have one variety of produce in my bin when I weighed it, but I would come up and I would weigh it. You can see that we have written on our bin how much the bin weighs. This bin weighs 2 pounds. So I'm going to look at the bottom, how much it weighs on our scale. It says 4 pounds, but I want to subtract 2 pounds. And then that is what I would write over on my harvest sheet. So I always have my harvest sheet right next to the bin so that anybody who is bringing produce in can go ahead and list it right on here. On our harvest sheet from this morning, it looks like mostly we actually added things up already, but sometimes if we're bringing in multiple bins of kale, for example, I might bring in a bin of kale and say, okay, I brought in 5.5 pounds. And then I'll have somebody else will bring in, Elle, our AmeriCorps, who's doing the filming, might bring in another bin of kale that's 6 pounds. And so she'll add plus 6. And then Taryn, our other AmeriCorps, might bring in another one that's 6.5 pounds, and she'll write plus 6.5. So I like writing them all down, and then when we add it up and we have the total, then we circle it, so that way we know, okay, we have finished harvesting kale, this is the total, so that when I go and add it into our harvest records, that's how it works best. Once we have weighed things, we'll go and we'll bring them over to our wash sink. Our wash sinks, we have cold water. We're on city water, so it's food safe. It's safe drinking water. We usually rinse it in straight water in the first bin, and in the second bin we put in a little bit of hydrogen peroxide. You can buy it as Sanidate or Oxidate. Those are food safe, very concentrated amounts of hydrogen peroxide, so that when you put a little bit in, you can read it on the label how much, that it's the right amount to help to sanitize your produce, to make sure that like where you're handing it off to, it's really good and healthy. When we start cleaning up, when we start setting up a wash station in the morning, we put down surfaces, we put down plastic on our tables so that we can wipe them down and sanitize them with a bleach solution. We wipe down every surface in the whole wash station to make sure that we're not introducing any microorganisms that we don't want to pass on to our customers. With the way the produce moves through our wash station is it gets weighed, it gets washed, it gets packed into bins, and then we have a couple of refrigerators back in our shed. A couple things that are really helpful about wash stations, if you're setting one up, is really try and make it have some shade. In the winter, we try and wash in one of the high tunnels because it's, you know, even if it's 55, if it's 55 and not windy, that's a lot better than 40 and windy outside, or even colder. In the winter, when it's really important to wait until it's gotten above freezing to harvest, because if you harvest things like spinach while they're frozen, they won't last at all. They'll just sort of thaw and turn to mush. But a spinach could live through a freeze, and as long as it's still in the ground, once it thaws, you can harvest it. I have poured water on them to get it above freezing, which we'll do in a pinch, but if you have a time during the day when you can harvest it when it's above freezing, it's much more pleasant to harvest dry spinach at 40 degrees than wet spinach at 40 degrees for your hands. I'm going to take a quick look at my notes and see if I've left anything off. So if you're trying to adapt this more to your home garden, you might just think about ways to harvest that if you want to choose things where you want to have a little bit of something all the time. So that might be a good idea to grow some fruiting crops where, like peas, where you might get peas off of those pea plants for 6 or 8 weeks, but you won't get tons all at once. But there are varieties you can choose. For example, of beans, Easy Pick is a variety that it kind of all comes on all in 1 week. And so if you were trying to make dilly beans or some kind of can project or some kind of like large scale project, you might want to select a variety that comes on all at once. Or you can sort of think about your successions and how often you want to plant something so that you have it throughout the year. If you wanted to have lettuce all the way through the summer, you would want to like seed it every 3 weeks, say, because there's going to be some variation in how fast those heads grow, but not so much. You know, if you want to start harvesting it in April, you could start it 8 weeks before, so in February in a windowsill, but then every 3 to 4 weeks you'd be wanting to start another batch of lettuce. There are some things that, a lot of things, if you're doing it as a cut and come again, so like say arugula or leaf lettuce, that you want to cut it at the base and wait for it to grow back. Be aware that it takes different amounts of time depending on the season. And so, you know, in March, it might take a whole month for that to grow back, whereas in June, it might grow back in 10 days. And that also sort of depends on making sure that you're watering it regularly as well. So if you're trying to plan your garden, make sure you do things in several successions. That's almost always a good idea, except for really long crops. Let's see, what else do I have on here? Oh, yes, so I didn't pull this out, but we have a giant salad spinner, but it works just the same way as your salad spinner does at home. If I am washing my greens, I would take my tiny amount of greens here. Here we can wash all these at the same time. I would remove any bugs and let them live back outside. And then I'm going to put them in here. Sometimes I use a strainer if I have a lot of these, and then I try and move all of them over into the second wash, but I might miss a few, right? And so I will go through with a strainer to help pull them out of the first wash or out of the second wash, so that I'm a little bit more efficient. I will put them up into our rack to dry, and then I will run them through the salad spinner. Part of the reason for wanting to run them through the salad spinner is that, remember, like, some of the point of washing these is to get some of the dirt and soil off. Some of the point to washing these is to have another set of eyes doing quality control and making sure that we didn't put in a little yellow leaf, or that we didn't put in a little bit of weeds or anything like that. And most of it is really about just trying to bring the temperature down. So for things to hold well, we want to bring the temperature down and then have them be relatively dry. Not like super wilted dry out in the sun, but that's why we put them through the salad spinner, so that we're not delivering a whole bunch of water for them to sit in and rot in. I think that's all I have to say about these. So I hope this gave you a couple ideas for some tricks to help your harvest go faster and to help harvest produce that's really fresh and really ready, whether you're on a larger scale farm or a smaller scale garden in your backyard. We'll do another session next week on home scale composting. And as always, if you've been finding these helpful and are in a place where you're able to do so, Guidestone always appreciates donations, or you can keep up to date on all of the education and programs that we have here by liking us and following us on Facebook, or going to guidestonecolorado.org and joining our newsletter list. Thanks so much. We'll see you next week.